It has been a week, hasn't it? In a very real sense, there's a war going on. There is a war with lives being lost, missiles flying. Brothers and sisters in the Ukraine facing things that we fear. And by the grace of God, we're not experiencing ourselves, but just as it happened so quickly, there could happen here. I've got a question for us today as we think about the gospel according to David. Now, how do you deal with fear? How do we deal with kind of fear? How do we have courage to face every day of life? Maybe another way to ask it is, where is our trust? Where is your trust? It's times when the headlines get our attention like that, it really makes us ask those kind of questions. Maybe another way to ask the same kind of question is, how do you watch the news without totally freaking out? That's on an international scale, maybe a national scale. But you may be going through something today that is another kind of war. You may be going through a war within your family. You may be going through a war within yourself. You may be going through a war against God himself. And so as we think about the story of David and Goliath today, let me ask you this. How do you get out of bed every single day? Where does the courage come to face every single day, regardless of what's going on in the world? Where does the courage to face every single day come from? We're second week in a series on David. Now, I want to mention that Wednesday is Ash Wednesday, which is the beginning of Lent, which means we're in preparation for Easter. It's a time to set aside to think about all that Jesus has done for us. Wednesday from 11 to 1, this building, the sanctuary, will be open for prayers. There'll be meditative music. You can come in and pray and sit under the shadow of the cross to think about as we begin this march towards Easter on Ash Wednesday. And we're calling this series The Gospel According to David because there is so many stories. There's just a wealth of information about David. In fact, other than Jesus, we know more about David than any other Bible character. He shows up in 4 books of the Old Testament. There's also over 70 Psalms from his prayer journal that are part of our psalm. Almost half the Psalms were written by David. So not only do we get a chance to see what's going on in his life, we get a chance to see what's going on in his heart during that time. And so each week we're going to be taking a story, some of them very, very well known, some of them not as well known, taking a psalm and showing us how it points us to Jesus, to our Savior. How David's life and David's heart, because he was a man after God's own heart, lead us to a greater understanding and a bigger picture of who Jesus is. The first one we're going to tackle today is found in 1 Samuel. If you've got your Bible with you, it's 1 Samuel chapter 17. Now there's 50 some odd verses in that one story, and it's the story of David and Goliath. Ben and I were going to act out the story for you this morning, but we decided not to do that. You're very welcome. Yeah. And part of the reason for that is everybody knows the story. Everybody has heard the story of David and Goliath. But this morning, if you will, I want you to kind of put any other way that you've ever interpreted this story aside. And I'm going to ask you to see it as the gospel according to David. In 1 Samuel 17, we learn how to act confidently, how to see clearly, and how to walk humbly. How to act confidently, how to see clearly what's truly going on, and how to walk humbly with God through it all. So let's just kind of attack is not the right word. I want to address the way that we have normally been taught, or the way we normally approach this story. Now, if you've been near the church at all, you've probably heard this story. There's this huge guy named Goliath. There's this little guy named David. And David goes and he gets on the battlefield and he confronts his fears. Goliath represents the fears, and David represents the courage and the chutzpah to go out and face those. And if that's the way that you've always approached this story, I want to ask you to just shelve that, because that's not really what's going on here. That's not really what's going on. You see, so many times Goliath represents your fears. We look at them, they're intimidating, but David is your inspiring example to show you how to deal with those fears. Just go right at them. Disregard the fears. Face your fears, and the bigger they are, the harder they fall, right? Well, let's look at that a different way. Let's approach this as we act confidently. Now, I'm not going to say too much about acting in confidence. We'll come to that in a moment, but I am going to talk to you about some counterfeit confidence. There was a lot of confidence going on in this battlefield. There was a lot of people who were very, very confident. There was a whole army of Philistines that were confident that Goliath was going to win the day. There was a lot of confidence going on there. Let's just kind of step into it here, and in your mind's eye, think about this. Now, the Philistines, everybody go, boo. Boo. The Philistines were the bad guys. They were always the bad guys. They were sort of on the border. Well, they were literally on the border. And they were always sending raiding parties. They were always pushing the limits. They were always attacking. And there was this constant war between the Philistines and the Israelites. And this is one of those days. Now, the Philistines gathered their forces for war. For war. Now, we think of war in a very, very different way than war actually was in that day. We think of war as missiles and airstrikes and drones and even artillery or gunfire. Every bit of war in this day was done hand to hand. And so when these two armies would fight, they would come at each other just slashing and crashing all that they could. In fact, a guy named Robert Alter will come to here in a moment. He describes it this way. He says, after the battles, men would be covered with blood, but they didn't know if it was their blood or one of the enemy's blood. They had to check themselves because of the adrenaline flow to see if they were cut somewhere or if they were just wearing the blood of one of the other guys. It was brutal. It was an incredibly brutal hand-to-hand combat. And that's what they had come together to do. Saul and the Israelites assembled and camped in the valley of Echa and drew up their battle lines to meet the Philistines. The Philistines occupied one hill and the Israelites another, and the valley was between them. And a champion, and that word means a man between, named Goliath, who was from Gath, remember that for next week, came out of the Philistine camp, and his height was 6 cubits and a span. Now, we read that and we're like, whatever. Any NBA fans here? Anybody ever seen Taco Falls? I think he's on the Celtics. He was last year. Who knows where he'll end up this year, right? Taco Falls is the tallest man in the NBA. He's 7'6" tall. It's fun. Whenever he comes out onto the court, all those NBA players look tiny, which is no small feat, 7'6". Goliath was 2 feet taller than that. He was 9'6". He was huge. I'm 6'5". He was 3 feet taller than me. I bet he would really be uncomfortable on an Allegiant airline. I'm just saying. He was huge, but it goes on. Bible goes on and he tells us he had a bronze helmet on his head, and he wore a coat of scale armor of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. That's 125 pounds. He had on 125 pounds worth of armor. On his legs were bronze greaves, and bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like that of a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels, 15 pounds. Now, think about this. Remember, it's hand-to-hand combat. And one of the things that Alter says that he used to do was build a shield wall in front of him. He'd put men in front of him, and he was so tall, and that spear was so long that instead of engaging in hand-to-hand combat, he would just stand over them and stab and kill and kill and kill. He was a killing machine. In a sense, he was like artillery, that they would stand in front of him and protect him from being hit, and he would just kill and kill and kill. This guy was formidable. Now think about this. Goliath trusted in his size. He was bigger than anybody else on the battlefield, but he also trusted in his technology. Think about it. Why does the Bible go to so much detail to tell us about what he's got, what he's wearing, 125 pounds worth of armor? That was the latest, greatest technology available in the day. Nobody else had that technology. And so when Goliath steps onto the battlefield, not only is he huge, he is incredibly well equipped. He is incredibly formidable. But he had a problem because he also relied on his own inflated self-esteem. He thought he was impregnable. He thought nobody could get to him. And so he stepped into battle and he stepped into life without really recognizing the danger. Story goes on. He says he looked at David. Now we'll come back to this and through this, but David was a shepherd boy. You probably know the story, but David was 15 years old. He had to get an Uber to get to the front lines. He couldn't even drive. And he's a boy. And Saul tried to put his armor on him, and he said, I can't deal with this. And so he's a boy unarmed. And quite honestly, Goliath looked at David, and he saw he was a little more than a boy, and he despised him. Come here, and I'll give your flesh to the birds and to the wild animals. And he completely disregarded David as any kind of a threat. You see, when you disregard your fears, you become out of touch with the reality that we actually do live in a dangerous world. We see that this week in Russia and the Ukraine. For years, we have tried as a world, as a culture, to say evil doesn't exist. For years, we have tried to say, oh, nobody would ever upset the world order. We've all worked too hard to get it. And we underestimated the power of evil. What about in your own life? What are you tolerating today, saying, oh, I got that covered, I got that covered? It might be overspending. It might be an area that you know God would not have you to be in, called sin. It might be an overconfidence. Where is it that you are not giving due based on your own self-esteem and saying, I got this, I got this? Kurt Cobain once said or sang, I'm not sure, he said, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean that they aren't out to get you. Are you taking it seriously? Goliath didn't even take David seriously because he didn't see him as a threat. What are you tolerating in your life right now because you don't see it as a threat? Well, so Goliath trusted his size, his technology, and his own self-esteem. But Israel also had some counterfeit confidence going on here. Israel, well, I'll just pick it up. The story goes on. Goliath comes in and he says, am I not a Philistine, and are you not the servants of Saul? Wait a minute. I thought the Israelites were the servants of the living God. What is this? Are you not the servants of Saul? You see, what happened here was that a few years earlier, all the Israelites got together and said, we want a king. And Samuel the prophet said, God is your king. Oh, no. We want a king. We know God's our king, but we want a king we can touch. We want a king we can, like all the other cool kids have. Philistines have a king. Egyptians had a pharaoh. We want a king. We want a king who will lead us into battle. And it's a fascinating story. It's back in 1 Samuel 12 about how the people came to Samuel, the prophet, and said, give us a king. And God said, go ahead and let him have it. Just let them have it, but they're not going to like it. We'll come to that in a moment. This day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other. But on hearing this, the Philistines' words, King Saul and all the other Israelites were dismayed, and they were terrified. You see, they looked to their king for two really important reasons. Number one, he was the king. Robert Alter is a literature professor and also a Hebrew scholar. Great combination. And he says this: human kingships was linked to war. Tired of their vulnerability among the nations, the people wanted to experience the military security that a human king with his standing army could bring. And so in 1 Samuel 8, God warns them that this kind of king they're requesting would take their children and resources in order to sustain his royal court and the army. A king in line with the wishes of the Israelites was a military leader who would offer them peace and security, and soon God would provide them with such a leader in Saul, son of Kish. And rapidly or slowly or eventually, they shifted their trust from God and moved it over here to a king. And then when the king was needed, he hid in his tent because he was as scared as they were. I wonder how often we do the same thing. We shift our allegiance. When we have nothing, we say, God, please just give me whatever you got. And then as we get more and more and more, we start shifting our allegiance to our stuff. Where do you put your trust? Well, there's another reason why they looked to their king, because he was tall. He was head and shoulders above the others. He was the tallest man in Israel. I'm glad I don't live in that day. I would have been, right? He was a towering physical specimen, an impressive young man without equal among the Israelites, a head taller than any of the others, well suited to be the military ruler expected by the Israelites. You see, they had placed their hopes in their king, but God wanted them to place their hopes in him. They so quickly shifted. And it's easy for us to look back on that and go, how foolish that was. But again, how many times do we do the same thing? We shift our trust and our hope to our 401k. We shift our trust and our hope to our government. We shift our trust and our hope to somebody. And once we have moved God off of the throne of our life, we place our hope in us, because we place our hope in the one we depend on the most. You see, that was that counterfeit courage, that counterfeit confidence. Goliath shows up and he's the biggest guy in town, and so of course he's going to put his trust there. The Israelites show up and they've got their king finally, and of course they're going to put their trust there. But that's not what was really going on, because, see, David shows up and he begins to see clearly. He begins to see what was really going on. Now, as I said, David couldn't even drive to the battlefield. David was a shepherd. He was 14 or 15 years old. And he shows up to the camp. And all of a sudden he says, "Who's that?" And all the people said, "Oh, that's Goliath. That's Goliath." On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were terrified, and they were dismayed, and they were terrified. But instead of being dismayed and terrified, David was offended. He looked at that and he goes, "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of who? The living God. Who is this guy?" Now notice that word uncircumcised. That's a big deal. Because all the people who were in the covenant and the protection of God were circumcised. And everyone who wasn't, was not. He looks at him and he says, "What? Why are we afraid of him? He doesn't have the protection of God. And so word gets back to Saul, the king, that there's somebody who's willing to go down in the valley and fight the giant. Saul's like, oh yeah, great. As long as it's not me, that's fine. And so he starts hearing about him, and he calls for David to come see him. And David shows up, and I'm sure Saul's like, where's David? I'm right here. No. Where's David? Where's that battle-hardened warrior who's been through many, many battles with me? Where's that veteran? Where's that guy who's going to be our champion to go down and meet that champion? Where is he? And he says, it's just me. It's just me. And Saul scoffs at him. And David picks it up and he says, but your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be just like one of them because he has defied the armies of the living God. He could see clearly what was going on. And the Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine. You see, he had extraordinary clarity, and clarity was simply this: an enemy of God's people is an enemy of God. Goliath wasn't simply defying the army, Goliath was defying God himself. The one whose hope is in the Lord need not even fear when there is legitimately something to be afraid of. Later on in Psalm 25, we read what was going on maybe inside of David's heart, either in this situation or many other situations where he was in mortal danger. And he doesn't say, I trust my size. And he doesn't say, I trust my technology. And he certainly doesn't say, I trust my own self-esteem. I'm the king after all. You know what he says? In you, O Lord. In you, Lord, my God, I put my trust. In you, O Lord, I put my trust. Let's just say that together. In you, Lord, my God, I put my trust. Say it again. In you, Lord, my God, I put my trust. You see, this was the posture that God desired for the entire nation. But they just wouldn't stay there. How about you? Have you put your trust in him? Are you tempted to pull it back every time you watch the news? Are you tempted to pull it back every time things don't go the way that you want them to go? Are you tempted to pull it back in your fear? In you, O Lord. The psalm goes on and he says, no one who hopes in you will ever be put to shame. Guide me in your truth and teach me, for you are God, my Savior, and my hope is in you all day long. My hope is in you all day long. And so back to the battlefield. Here we've got Goliath on one side, we've got David on the other side, and David starts talking some trash. You know? I mean, I love this. David looks at me, he says, you come to me with a sword and a spear and a javelin, your technology, you got the best, you're the biggest, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, who you have defiled. I will strike you down, then I will feed the carcasses of the host of the Philistines on this day to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field, that the whole earth would know that I'm David. Isn't that the way that we've always read that? That the whole earth will know that there is a God in Israel. And this assembly will know that the Lord is not saved by sword or by javelin or by spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will deliver you into my hands. And so it is for those who hope in the Lord. They act confidently, they see clearly, and they walk humbly. And so where do we see the gospel in this passage? As I said, it's so easy for us to think that we identify with David. David is the hero, I'm the hero, I'm going to go out there, I'm going to face my battles, and I'm going to take them down in the name of God. But we shouldn't be identifying with David. We should be identifying with the Israelite army. Because you see, They're standing up on the mountain watching this whole thing go down, shaking in their boots because the stakes are so high. Remember this? Choose a man and have him come down to me, and if he is able to fight me, Goliath says, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us, otherwise known as slaves. We will take you. We will take everything you have. It's all or nothing. Jesus Christ went to a cross, and he paid our debt as our champion. Goliath was the enemy's champion. David was the Israelites' champion. Jesus is our champion because Jesus went to the cross, and the stakes were even higher. The stakes were eternal. And Jesus went to the cross for you and for me. We are not David. David is not an example. We are the Israelites. And Jesus has imputed, has given his victory to us. Just as all of the Israelites were freed because of what David did for them on that one day, we are freed because of what Jesus did for us on that one day. It's called imputation. The people were saved through imputation. It was given to us. What happened to David was imputed to the people. They didn't do it. But he gave them their freedom because of what he had done, because he was their champion. David was fighting against a champion. He was their legal representative. If he won, everybody won. If he lost, everybody lost. Listen to this. He was not fighting for them. He was fighting as them. He was fighting as them. David saved his people at the risk of his life, but Jesus saved his people at the cost of his life. David walked through the valley of the shadow of death, but Jesus walked right into death. Jesus is our champion. And the stakes were higher on the cross than they were in the valley. And yet, David imputed the victory to all Israel, and Jesus imputes the victory to all who will call on him today. Hebrews 11 picks up the theme. He says, remember Abraham, remember Moses, remember David, remember those stories, but fix your eyes on Jesus, the archegos, which means the champion in the Greek. Fix your eyes on Jesus, the champion of our faith. How do we approach each day? How do we get out of bed each day? How do we watch the news without freaking out? You see, we approach it with courage. But courage is not the absence of fear. It's the presence of enough joy that you're not afraid of the future. Where did D.A. Carson get that? It's from the rest of that verse in Hebrews 12. Fix your eyes on Jesus, the pioneer, the archegos, the perfecter, the champion of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, scorning his shame. What was the joy set before him? You were. I was. Those who would call upon his name. For the joy set before him to save us, to draw us to him, to make us his church, his bride. He endured the cross. It was appropriate that a few weeks ago I was reading from Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Dietrich Bonhoeffer led the confessing church, which was the Lutheran church in Germany during World War II. They stood up to Hitler and were trounced for it. In a book called Letters from Prison, Dietrich Bonhoeffer writes this. He says, what is your greatest nightmare? World War? That's very real, especially for him. Loss of love, loss of wealth, loss of life, your health. On the cross, Jesus Christ took the ultimate nightmare. The ultimate nightmare is to be alienated from God, and if God is a God, you were made by God. Unless Jesus Christ does something about the way you've lived your life, you will be lost. And that is the ultimate nightmare. Ultimate poverty, ultimate loneliness, ultimate death is to be lost. It's to be alienated from God spiritually forever. And on the cross, Jesus Christ experienced that cosmic alienation. He took your greatest nightmares. What does that mean? If you believe in him, it means you are finally, and forever safe. Do you know the gospel? Do you know the gospel? David understood a little bit more of the gospel because in Psalm 30, which is one of the Psalms that he wrote, he said this, "Weeping may last for the night, but joy comes in the morning." Weeping may last for the night. In this world you will have trouble, but take courage. Jesus says, "I have overcome the world." Weeping may last for the night, but take courage. I have overcome the world. And so we look at what it means to walk humbly. It simply means to speak what David spoke, to walk as David walked. In you, my Lord God, I put my trust. My hope is in you all day long. In you, my God, I put my trust. My hope is in you all the day long. In you, Lord, my God, I put my trust. My hope is in you all the day long. Let's stand together and just confess that as we face our fears, as we don't know what tomorrow holds, but we do know who holds the future. Let's just confess that today together. In you, Lord my God, I put my trust. My hope is in you all day long. One more time. In you, my Lord, my God, I put my trust. My hope is in you all day long. Gracious God, may this be the words of our heart. May this be the words of our lips. May this be the soundtrack of our life, that in you we put our trust. In you we put our trust all the day long. When fears come and they are tempted to undermine our trust in you I put my trust. When you have blessed me and I have stuff, and I'm tempted to move my trust from you to the stuff, in you I put my trust. When health challenges or financial challenges or relational challenges or any other kind of challenges come and tempt to pull my eyes off of you, in you I put my trust. Would you draw our eyes back to Jesus Christ, the author, the perfecter, the champion of our faith? Because in you we put our trust all the day long, all the day.